Here's a question that sounds simple, but almost nobody gets right on the first guess. Imagine you're offered a choice. Option 1, I hand you $3 million in cash, right now, today. Option 2, I give you a single penny, but that penny doubles in value every single day for 31 days. Which option do you take? Almost everyone's gut instinct says take the $3 million. A penny is basically nothing. Even after a week of doubling, it's still worth less than $1. But let's actually run the math. After 10 days, that penny is worth about $5. After 20 days, it's worth around $5,000, still nowhere close to $3 million. And at this point, most people would feel pretty confident they made the smarter choice by taking the cash. But here's where it gets strange. By day 25, that penny is worth over $160,000. And by day 31, the very last day, that single penny, doubling on itself, again and again, is worth over $10 million. More than 3 times the lump sum everyone instinctively grabbed at the start. That thought experiment is the entire engine behind one of the most quietly influential success books ever written, a short, no-nonsense book called The Compound Effect. Its core argument is almost insulting in its simplicity. Small, smart choices, repeated consistently over time, produce results so disproportionately large that they look like magic from the outside, even though there was never anything magical about them at all. The man who wrote this book wasn't a psychologist or an academic. He spent decades as the publisher of one of the most widely read success and business magazines in the country, which gave him direct, repeated access to interview some of the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders alive. People building massive companies, managing massive fortunes, leading massive organizations. And after years of sitting across from these people, asking them how they actually got there, he kept noticing the same unglamorous, almost boring pattern over and over again. It was never one brilliant idea or one lucky break. It was always some version of the exact same formula. Smart, ordinary choices, made consistently, for long enough that compounding eventually did the rest of the work. He wasn't just observing this from the outside, either. He was a product of these exact same principles himself. He started his first business as a teenager, was earning a 6-figure income by 18, was making over $1 million a year by 24, and by his late 20s was running a company generating $50 million a year in revenue. None of that came from one dramatic breakthrough. It came from the same compounding logic he later distilled into this book. In this video, I'm going to walk you through everything genuinely useful inside the compound effect. Not a shallow highlight reel, but a full, practical breakdown of exactly how this formula works and how to start using it in your own life starting today. We'll cover why small choices feel so deceptively unimportant in the moment, the real math behind why consistency beats intensity almost every single time, the role habits and momentum play in either compounding your success or compounding your decline, and the often overlooked influence of the people, environment, and information you surround yourself with every day. Stick around until the end, because the final section is where most people either commit to actually using this or quietly forget about it by next week. Let's start with the core problem this entire book is trying to solve. Most people massively overvalue dramatic, one-time actions and massively undervalue small, repeated ones. We're drawn to the idea of the big leap, the all-or-nothing diet, the overnight business success, the single decision that changes everything. Meanwhile, we walk right past the actual lever that determines almost everything about our lives, the accumulated weight of thousands of small, seemingly insignificant choices we make and repeat almost without thinking. Part of why this happens is that small choices simply don't feel consequential in the moment. Skipping a workout today doesn't visibly change anything about your body tomorrow. Spending an extra $10 on something you didn't need doesn't visibly dent your bank account. Watching one more hour of mindless television instead of working on something that matters to you doesn't visibly cost you anything you can point to. Each of these choices in isolation really is almost meaningless. The trap is believing that because each individual choice is small, the pattern of repeating that choice, day after day, year after year, must also be small. It isn't. It's exactly the opposite. Small choices are where compounding either works powerfully for you or works just as powerfully against you, completely invisible to the naked eye until the results have already piled up. This brings us to the central formula of the entire book, stated almost mathematically. Choices plus consistency plus time equals the compound effect. Take away any one of these three ingredients and the formula collapses. A great choice made only once does almost nothing on its own. Consistency without enough time hasn't had a chance to compound yet. And time alone, without consistent good choices feeding into it, just lets bad patterns compound just as efficiently as good ones. There's a deeper principle hiding underneath this formula, and it's arguably the most important idea in the entire book. You are 100% responsible for everything that happens in your life, including the results you don't like. This isn't about blame in some harsh, guilt-tripping sense. It's about reclaiming power. The moment you decide that your circumstances, your boss, your upbringing, your bad luck, are the reason your life looks the way it does, you've also, without realizing it, handed away your own ability to change it. The traffic that made you late wasn't really the problem. Leaving the house later than you needed to was the actual choice that led there. The blown deadline wasn't really your coworker's fault. Not double-checking the work earlier was the choice that allowed it to happen. None of this is about self-blame. It's about recognizing that nearly every outcome in your life traces back, eventually, to a long chain of choices that were actually within your control, even when it felt easier in the moment to point somewhere else. Now let's go deeper into the math behind compounding, because understanding why it works is what makes it possible to actually trust the process during the long stretch where nothing visible seems to be happening yet. Imagine two people who are, in every meaningful way, identical. Same income, same starting weight, same daily schedule, same level of ambition. Person 1 makes a series of slightly better choices each day. They read for 20 minutes instead of scrolling. They walk instead of driving for short errands. They put a small percentage of every paycheck into savings before they can spend it. They go to bed 20 minutes earlier so they're not running on empty the next morning. Person 2 makes the opposite series of slightly worse choices. A bit more scrolling, a bit more convenience driving, spending the entire paycheck, staying up a little later most nights. On day 1, the difference between these two people is completely invisible. You could not tell them apart by looking at their bank accounts, their bodies, or their calendars. Even after a month, the gap is still small enough that an outside observer probably wouldn't notice anything meaningful. This is exactly the part of the process that destroys most people's motivation. The long, quiet stretch where the math is working perfectly behind the scenes, but the visible evidence hasn't caught up yet. It's the same mechanism behind that doubling penny sitting at a few dollars after a week, technically growing, but not yet looking like anything worth bragging about. But the compounding never stops just because it's invisible. By month 6, the gap between these two people has become noticeable. By year 2, it's substantial. By year 5, these two people who started in nearly identical positions are now living what look like completely different lives, different health, different finances, different sense of control over their own days, even though neither of them ever made one single dramatic decision that explains the entire gap. The entire difference is just the patient, repeated compounding of choices so small that, on any individual day, they would have seemed barely worth mentioning. This same compounding math runs in the negative direction with equally relentless precision. And this is the part most people genuinely don't want to think about. The slow weight gain from years of slightly too large portions, the mounting debt from years of slightly too loose spending, the drifting apart in a relationship from years of slightly too little real attention. None of these outcomes were caused by one terrible decision. They were caused by the same compounding mechanism, just running in reverse, completely unnoticed, for years, until the results finally became impossible to ignore. Here's a particularly useful way to think about why tiny margins matter so much more than people assume, borrowed from how horse races actually pay out. A horse that wins a race by a single nose, an almost invisible margin to the naked eye, doesn't earn just slightly more prize money than the horse that came in second. It often earns 10 times as much, sometimes more. The actual difference in speed between the two horses was almost nothing. But the difference in reward was enormous, because the entire system is built around small margins translating into massive outcomes once you cross a threshold. Life works in a strikingly similar way. The gap between someone living an exceptional life and someone living an average one is rarely some enormous difference in talent or effort. It's usually a small, sustained margin, applied consistently, for long enough that the compounding effect eventually produces a gap far larger than the original margin ever suggested it would. Now let's talk about habits, because habits are really just the delivery mechanism through which all of this compounding actually happens. A choice you make once is just a choice. A choice you make automatically, day after day, without even having to think about it anymore, is a habit, and habits are exactly where the real compounding takes place, for better or worse. One of the most important things to understand about bad habits is how quietly they form. Almost nobody consciously decides, starting today, I'm going to develop an unhealthy relationship with sugar, or starting today, I'm going to become someone who avoids difficult conversations. Bad habits sneak in through repetition of choices that each, individually, seemed completely harmless at the time. One late-night snack becomes a pattern. One avoided conversation becomes a pattern of avoidance. By the time the habit is fully formed and clearly visible, it's already had months or years of repetition compounding underneath the surface. This is exactly why willpower alone is such an unreliable tool for lasting change. Willpower is a finite resource that gets depleted throughout the day, especially under stress, and bad habits tend to show up precisely during the moments willpower is weakest, late at night, after a stressful meeting, when you're exhausted and your guard is down. Relying purely on willpower to override a deeply repeated habit is a bit like trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. It might work for a moment, but it's not a sustainable long-term strategy. A more reliable approach is recognizing the role of rationalization, the quiet inner voice that talks you out of the better choice in the exact moment you're making it. I've had a really hard day, I deserve this. I'll just skip the gym today and double up tomorrow. It's just this one time, it won't matter. Each one of these thoughts sounds completely reasonable in isolation, which is exactly why they're so dangerous. The problem isn't any single instance of rationalization. The problem is that rationalization, left unchecked, becomes its own habit, a reliable escape hatch your mind learns to reach for every single time discipline gets even slightly uncomfortable. Recognizing rationalization in the moment it's happening, rather than after the fact, is one of the most underrated skills in actually breaking a long-running bad habit. Let's move to the next major piece of this framework: momentum. There's a basic principle from physics that applies just as cleanly to human behavior as it does to physical objects. An object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion, unless something acts on it to change that. Starting something new, a habit, a project, a relationship, a business, almost always requires far more energy than continuing something already in motion. This is exactly why the first workout after months away from the gym feels brutal, while the 40th workout in a row feels almost automatic. The friction was never really about the workout itself. It was about the initial inertia of getting something moving from a dead stop. This has a really important practical implication. The early days of any new habit are always going to feel disproportionately hard compared to how it'll feel later, once momentum has built up. A lot of people misread this initial difficulty as proof that the habit isn't a good fit for them, or that they just aren't disciplined enough, when really, they're just experiencing the completely normal physics of getting something moving from rest. The people who succeed long-term aren't the ones who never feel that initial resistance. They're the ones who push through it anyway, specifically because they understand that the resistance is temporary and momentum is coming, as long as they don't stop too early. Once momentum does build, it becomes a genuinely powerful force of its own, sometimes called Big Mo by people who study performance and success. A business that's gaining momentum attracts opportunities almost on its own. A person who's built 3 months of consistent exercise finds the fourth month dramatically easier than the first. A habit that's running on momentum starts to feel less like a discipline you're forcing and more like simply who you are. This is part of why consistency consistently beats intensity over the long run. Someone who works out intensely for 2 weeks and then quits never builds enough momentum to make the habit self-sustaining. Someone who works out moderately but never stops eventually reaches a point where the habit carries itself forward almost automatically. This also explains why breaks and inconsistency are so much more costly than they appear to be at the time. It's not just that you lose the benefit of the days you skipped. You lose the momentum you'd built up, and momentum, once lost, has to be rebuilt almost from scratch, requiring that same high friction, low reward starting energy all over again. This is exactly why protecting an existing streak is often more valuable than it logically seems. You're not just protecting one day's worth of progress, you're protecting the accumulated momentum of every day that came before it. Now let's talk about the fourth major piece of the framework, and arguably the one people underestimate the most: influences. The argument here is that your results are shaped not just by your own individual choices, but by four outside forces constantly pressing on those choices, often without you ever consciously noticing them. Those four forces are the people you associate with, the physical environment you spend your time in, the information you consistently feed your mind, and the mentors, real or distant, whose example you're following, whether deliberately or not. Let's start with associations, the people you spend the most time around. There's a well-documented tendency for people to gradually become more similar to the 5 or 6 people they interact with most regularly in terms of habits, attitudes, even income level and health outcomes. This isn't some mystical idea, it's simple, repeated social exposure. If the people around you treat skipping workouts as normal, complaining as the default conversational mode, or spending beyond their means as unremarkable, that becomes your baseline for normal too, often without any conscious decision on your part. The practical implication is uncomfortable but important. A genuine, honest audit of who you're spending the most time with, and an honest look at whether their habits pull you toward or away from the person you're trying to become, is one of the highest leverage moves available to almost anyone. Next is environment, the physical spaces and objects that surround you every day. We tend to drastically overestimate our own willpower and drastically underestimate the influence of our surroundings. A kitchen stocked with junk food will eventually win against willpower, regardless of how disciplined you believe yourself to be, simply because you'll be exposed to that temptation dozens of times a day, every single day, for years. A cluttered, chaotic workspace makes focused work harder no matter how motivated you feel walking into it. Redesigning your environment so that the good choice is the obvious, convenient one, and the bad choice requires extra effort to access, does more heavy lifting than almost any amount of raw self-discipline. Then there's input, the media, news, conversations, and content you consistently expose your mind to. Just as your body is shaped by what you eat, your mindset is shaped by what you consistently feed it mentally. A steady diet of negative news, comparison-driven social media, or pessimistic conversation gradually shapes your baseline outlook, your sense of what's possible, and even your tolerance for the discomfort required to pursue meaningful goals, often in ways you won't notice happening in real time. This doesn't mean ignoring reality or living in a bubble. It means being deliberate about your information diet the same way you'd be deliberate about your actual diet, recognizing that what you consistently consume eventually becomes part of how you think. Finally, there's mentorship, learning directly or indirectly from people who are further along the specific path you're trying to walk. This doesn't require some formal, dramatic mentor relationship. It can be as simple as deliberately studying how someone you admire structures their day, or following the specific advice of someone who has already solved the exact problem you're currently facing, rather than trying to figure everything out entirely from scratch through trial and error. The core insight is that you don't have to personally make every single mistake yourself in order to learn the lesson. You can borrow years of someone else's hard-earned experience just by paying close, deliberate attention to how they actually operate. There's one more piece of momentum worth understanding clearly, because it changes how you think about the effort required at different stages of this process. Building a new pattern from nothing requires a disproportionately large amount of energy, attention, and deliberate effort. But once that pattern is genuinely established, running on real momentum, maintaining it requires only a small fraction of that original effort, almost like the difference between pushing a stalled car to get it rolling versus simply steering it once it's already moving at a steady speed. A lot of people unconsciously expect maintenance to feel just as hard as the initial build, and when it doesn't, they sometimes mistake that newfound ease for the habit not really mattering anymore, and quietly let it slip. Recognizing that this drop in required effort is a sign of success, not a sign of complacency, helps you stay consistent precisely during the stage where the habit has finally become easy enough to take for granted. Let's make the associations piece more concrete with a simple, slightly uncomfortable exercise you can actually do. Write down the names of the 5 people you spend the most time talking to or being around in a typical week. For each one, ask yourself honestly, in the specific area I'm trying to improve, does spending time with this person make that change easier or harder? You're not being asked to dramatically cut people out of your life. And for many relationships, particularly family, that's not even a realistic or desirable option in the first place. The point of the exercise is simply awareness. If 4 out of your 5 closest connections treat the habit you're trying to change as unusual, unnecessary, or even something to gently mock, that's an environment quietly working against you every single day, whether you've consciously noticed it or not. Sometimes the most effective move isn't removing anyone. It's simply adding 1 or 2 new connections, a class, a group, an online community, where the specific change you're working on is treated as completely normal, giving you somewhere to recalibrate your sense of what's typical alongside your existing relationships. Let's get practical now and talk about the actual tools that turn all of this from an interesting idea into something you can use starting today. The first tool, and arguably the single most powerful one in the entire framework, is tracking. There's an old management principle that what gets measured gets managed, and it applies just as directly to your personal life as it does to running a business. The exercise is simple, almost embarrassingly so. For the next 2 to 3 weeks, track something you suspect might be quietly working against you. If you suspect you're overspending, write down every single purchase, no matter how small. If you suspect you're not eating well, write down everything you eat, with no judgment, just observation. If you suspect you're wasting time, track exactly how you spend each hour of your day for a week. The reason this works so well isn't really about the data itself. It's about the simple act of paying conscious attention to something that's normally running entirely on autopilot. The vast majority of people who do this exercise honestly report being genuinely shocked by what they find, not because their behavior was secretly catastrophic, but because so much of it had become completely invisible to their own awareness. You cannot intentionally improve a pattern you're not consciously aware of, and tracking is the fastest, most reliable way to drag an unconscious pattern into the light where you can actually do something about it. The second tool is building an accountability, deliberately creating a structure where someone else knows what you've committed to and will notice, and ideally say something, if you don't follow through. Accountability works because it adds a layer of social consequence to a choice that would otherwise only carry private, easily rationalized consequences. It's far easier to talk yourself out of a commitment when the only person who will ever know is you. It's a different story entirely when you know a specific person is going to ask you, directly, whether you actually did the thing you said you would. The third tool is what you might call the margin strategy, deliberately identifying one or two specific areas where you can apply just a small, consistent extra effort, rather than trying to overhaul every single area of your life simultaneously. Remember, this entire framework is built on the idea that small, consistent margins compound into outsized results over time. Trying to apply massive effort across 10 different areas of your life at once almost always leads to burnout and abandonment within a few weeks. Choosing one or two specific margins, reading 15 extra minutes a day, saving an extra 5% of every paycheck, having one slightly more honest conversation a week, and sticking with just those, consistently, for months, produces far more durable results than a short-lived, all-encompassing overhaul ever could. The fourth tool is scheduling regular check-ins with yourself, brief, honest moments where you step back and ask how your current choices, habits, and influences are actually lining up with the direction you say you want your life to go. Without this kind of regular reflection, even a genuinely good system can quietly drift off course over months, not because anything dramatic went wrong, but because nobody was paying close attention to the slow, accumulating direction of all those small daily choices. Now let's talk about the common obstacles that derail people, even after they fully understand everything we've covered so far. The first obstacle is impatience, specifically, giving up during that long, invisible stretch where compounding is technically working, but hasn't produced visible results yet. This is the single biggest reason people abandon good habits and good systems. They expect the curve of results to look like a straight line rising steadily from day one, when in reality it looks almost flat for a frustratingly long time before suddenly curving sharply upward. Quitting during that flat stretch means giving up the moment before the math was actually about to start paying off. The second obstacle is the all-or-nothing trap, the belief that one missed day, one bad decision, or one broken streak means the entire effort has failed and may as well be abandoned. This thinking treats a single data point as if it were the entire trend line. In reality, the compounding effect cares about your overall pattern across months and years, not about any single isolated slip. The actual danger isn't the missed day itself. It's using that missed day as an excuse to abandon the pattern altogether. The third obstacle is underestimating the influence of your environment and associations, while overestimating your own willpower. People often blame themselves harshly for lacking discipline, in situations where the much more effective fix would have been redesigning their environment or their social circle, rather than simply trying to white-knuckle their way through constant temptation using sheer force of will. The fourth obstacle is waiting for motivation before taking action, rather than building the habit first and letting motivation follow as a result of momentum, rather than a precondition for it. Motivation is notoriously unreliable. It rises and falls with sleep, mood, and stress, while momentum, once built, tends to generate its own motivation simply by making continued progress feel good and continued inaction feel increasingly uncomfortable. Let's look at how this framework actually plays out in a few realistic, everyday situations. Consider someone deep in credit card debt who feels like the hole is simply too large to ever climb out of through small changes. The compounding approach here isn't a single dramatic financial overhaul. It's identifying one specific small margin, an extra $50 a month put directly toward the highest interest balance, paired with tracking every single purchase for a month to find where money is quietly leaking out unnoticed. The first month's progress looks almost insignificant against the total debt, but the combination of a slightly larger payment, slightly tighter tracking, and the elimination of one or two small leaks, compounded consistently over 2 or 3 years, is precisely how people climb out of debt that once felt completely insurmountable. Consider someone whose health has been quietly declining for years through 1,000 small decisions, slightly larger portions, slightly less movement, slightly worse sleep, none of which felt significant in the moment they were made. The compounding fix isn't a radical, unsustainable health transformation starting Monday. It's identifying the smallest possible version of a better choice. A 10-minute walk instead of no walk at all. One slightly smaller portion at one specific meal. Going to bed 15 minutes earlier. And stacking that single small margin consistently for months, trusting that the same compounding mechanism that quietly created the decline can just as reliably reverse it. Consider someone whose closest relationship has slowly drifted into distance and routine, not through any single fight or betrayal, but through years of slightly distracted conversations and slightly skipped check-ins. The compounding fix here isn't one grand romantic gesture. It's a small, repeatable margin, one fully present, phone-down conversation a day, one specific question that goes beyond the surface, repeated consistently enough that the relationship's trajectory gradually bends back in the other direction. The pattern across every one of these examples is the same. The fix is never a single dramatic action. It's identifying one small, sustainable margin and trusting the same compounding mechanism that quietly created the problem to just as quietly, and just as reliably, create the solution, given enough consistency and enough time. It's worth pausing to look at why this framework lines up so well with established research in behavioral economics and psychology, because none of this is just motivational language. It reflects some well-documented quirks in how human beings actually make decisions. One relevant concept is something researchers call present bias, or hyperbolic discounting, our brain's strong tendency to value immediate rewards far more heavily than future ones, even when the future reward is objectively, mathematically larger. This is exactly why the penny that doubles for 31 days feels like the wrong choice at first glance, even though it's mathematically far superior. Our brains aren't naturally wired to intuitively grasp exponential growth. We're wired to react strongly to whatever reward is right in front of us, right now. Understanding this bias doesn't make it disappear entirely, but it does let you consciously override your gut instinct in situations, like long-term habits and compounding choices, where that gut instinct is reliably wrong. Another relevant concept is the idea of identity-consistent behavior, the well-documented tendency for people to act in ways that confirm whatever story they already believe about themselves. Someone who has come to believe, "I'm just not good with money," will, often unconsciously, make choices that confirm that belief, while someone who believes, "I'm the kind of person who plans ahead financially," will make different choices, almost automatically, simply to stay consistent with that self-image. This connects directly back to the responsibility principle we discussed earlier. Taking ownership of your choices isn't just a moral stance, it's a practical lever, because it gradually shifts your underlying self-image in a direction that makes the better choices feel automatic rather than like a constant uphill fight. There's also solid research behind the power of environmental design that we touched on earlier. Multiple well-known studies on food choice, for example, have found that simply changing the order or visibility of items, putting healthier options at eye level and less healthy options further out of reach, measurably shifts what people choose, even though the people themselves report feeling like their choice was based purely on personal preference. This supports the broader argument that environment is not a minor factor sitting on the sidelines of willpower. It's often the dominant factor, quietly steering outcomes long before willpower is ever consciously engaged. Since this book became widely read, the pattern people report after actually applying it tends to look remarkably similar across very different starting situations. It's almost never a dramatic, overnight transformation. It's a slow, occasionally boring sense of small things going slightly better, week after week, until at some point, often months in, they look back and realize the gap between where they started and where they are now has become large enough that it's hard to believe it happened gradually, one unremarkable day at a time. A particularly consistent pattern is that the people who get the most out of this framework are rarely the ones who were already the most naturally disciplined. They're the ones who got the most honest with themselves during the tracking phase, the ones willing to actually look clearly at where their small daily choices were quietly leading them, rather than relying on a vague, optimistic sense that things would probably work out fine on their own. To stay balanced, it's worth acknowledging a few fair criticisms and limitations of this framework too. The first is that an intense focus on personal responsibility, while genuinely empowering for many people, can sometimes underweight very real structural and systemic obstacles, unequal access to resources, healthcare, education, or simply enough stable free time to apply any of these tools in the first place. Someone working multiple jobs just to cover rent has a meaningfully different starting position than someone with financial breathing room, and pretending those situations are identical, simply requiring the same small choices, isn't entirely fair or accurate. The second is that the framework can occasionally tip into an oversimplified narrative, where literally everything in a person's life is framed purely as the result of their own choices, sometimes underweighting the role of genuine luck, timing, and circumstance that even the most disciplined, consistent people benefit from along the way. Most people who have achieved significant success readily admit that some portion of it came down to fortunate timing or unearned advantage, alongside the disciplined choices that get most of the credit in hindsight. The third is that, on its own, the compounding framework doesn't address situations involving genuine trauma, clinical mental health conditions, or addiction, situations where the underlying mechanism driving someone's choices is considerably more complex than simple decision-making and habit formation, and where more specialized support is often necessary alongside, or even before, any kind of self-directed system like this one. Taking these limitations into account, the fair conclusion is that this framework is an extremely useful lens for the vast majority of everyday decisions most people are actively in control of, but it works best as one tool among several, not as a complete, universal explanation for every outcome in every person's life. Let's run through a practical month-long plan you could realistically start today, broken down week by week. In week 1, spend the entire week purely tracking, no changes yet, just honest observation. Pick the one area of your life you suspect is quietly working against you the most: money, food, time, or attention, and track it with complete honesty without trying to fix anything yet. The goal this week is simply awareness. In week 2, look back at what you tracked and identify exactly one small, specific margin you're going to apply consistently. Not 5 changes, just one. Define it precisely, what exactly you'll do differently, and how you'll know whether you actually did it each day. In week 3, set up one piece of accountability around that single margin. Telling one specific person what you're doing and asking them to check in with you partway through the week. Also, take a few minutes this week to honestly look at your environment and your closest associations, and ask whether either of them is quietly working for or against the specific change you're trying to make. In week 4, do your first honest review. Has the margin become slightly easier to maintain than it was in week 1? That slight increase in ease is the earliest visible sign of momentum building, even if the outcome itself still looks small. Decide whether to keep the same margin running for another month, or layer in one additional small margin now that the first one feels more automatic. And the most important note about this entire plan is this: none of it requires waiting for the start of a new year, a new month, or some perfect moment to begin. The tracking week can start today, with whatever's left of today, simply by writing down the next thing you do. Let's do a quick recap of everything covered in this video. First, the core formula. Choices plus consistency plus time equals the compound effect, and removing any single one of those 3 ingredients collapses the entire mechanism. Second, the responsibility principle. Taking full ownership of your choices, rather than assigning blame outward, is what restores your actual power to change the trajectory you're currently on. Third, the math of compounding. Results stay nearly invisible for a long, sometimes discouraging stretch, before eventually curving sharply upward, which is exactly why so many people quit right before the results were about to become visible. Fourth, habits. The delivery mechanism through which compounding actually happens, formed through repetition rather than single decisions, and most reliably broken by recognizing rationalization in the exact moment it shows up, rather than relying purely on willpower after the fact. Fifth, momentum. The disproportionate difficulty of starting something from a dead stop, and the disproportionate ease of continuing something already in motion, which is exactly why consistency reliably outperforms short bursts of intensity over the long run. Sixth, influences. The 4 outside forces, associations, environment, input, and mentors, quietly shaping your choices long before you consciously weigh in, and the practical value of auditing all 4 honestly. And finally, the practical tools. Tracking to build awareness, accountability to add real consequence, identifying one specific small margin instead of trying to overhaul everything at once, and scheduling regular, honest check-ins to keep the whole system from quietly drifting off course. Let's run through a few frequently asked questions before we move toward the final part of this video. Question 1. How small does a small choice actually need to be for this to work? Smaller than feels meaningful, almost always. If a change feels significant enough that you need real motivation to sustain it, it's probably still too large for the early stage of building consistency. The goal in the beginning isn't impact, it's repeatability. A change so small it feels almost silly is usually exactly the right size to start with, because the entire point is making it through the low motivation days without breaking the pattern. Question 2. What if I track my choices honestly and don't find anything particularly alarming? That's a genuinely good outcome, and it still tells you something valuable, that your current patterns are probably serving you reasonably well in that specific area. In that case, the more useful move is picking a different area of your life to examine, since it's rare for every single domain, money, time, health, relationships, attention, to be equally well optimized all at once. Question 3. How do I stay motivated through that long, invisible stretch before results show up? Honestly, motivation is the wrong thing to rely on here. The far more reliable tool is the tracking and accountability structure we covered earlier, because those don't depend on how you feel on any given day. You don't need to feel motivated to mark down what you spent or to answer a friend's check-in text. You just need the structure to exist, and the structure can carry you through the exact stretch where motivation typically runs out. Question 4. Is it ever too late to start applying this if I've already let a bad pattern compound for years? No, and this is actually one of the more genuinely hopeful aspects of the entire framework. Compounding doesn't care how long a pattern has been running in one direction before you decide to change it. The math works exactly the same way whether you start today after one bad year or one bad decade. The only real cost of waiting longer is the additional time the old pattern gets to keep compounding before you redirect it, not some kind of point of no return. Question 5. Should I try to apply this framework to every area of my life all at once? Almost certainly not, at least not at first. The entire premise of this approach is that small, focused margins beat large, scattered efforts. Choosing one or two specific areas, mastering the tracking and consistency there until it feels close to automatic, and then expanding to a new area produces far more durable results than trying to overhaul your finances, your health, your relationships, and your career all in the same week. Before we move on, let's clear up a few common myths about this kind of small changes approach, because these myths quietly talk a lot of people out of even trying. Myth number 1. Small changes are only for people who don't need big results. This gets the entire mechanism backwards. Small changes aren't a watered-down substitute for big results. They're the actual mechanism that produces big results, once enough time has been allowed for compounding to take effect. The people who have achieved the biggest results rarely did so by skipping the small changes phase. They simply stuck with it for far longer than most people are willing to. Myth number 2. If a change isn't producing visible results within a few weeks, it must not be working. As we covered with the plateau before the breakthrough, this is almost exactly backwards. The weeks where nothing visible seems to be happening are usually the weeks where the underlying math is working most reliably, simply hidden below the surface. Judging a compounding strategy by its first few weeks is a bit like judging a doubling penny by how unimpressive it looks on day 5. Myth number 3. Discipline is mostly about willpower and mental toughness. The framework we've covered points to something quite different, that discipline is far more reliably built through tracking, accountability, and environment design than through raw willpower alone. People who seem to have superhuman discipline have usually just built systems that make the right choice the path of least resistance, rather than constantly fighting an uphill battle against temptation using sheer mental force. Myth number 4. You need to find the one perfect habit or system before starting. In reality, an imperfect system you actually stick with for months will reliably outperform a theoretically perfect system you abandon after 2 weeks because it felt too complicated to sustain. The goal isn't finding the ideal approach on paper. It's finding an approach simple enough that you'll genuinely still be doing it 3 months from now. Let's bring every piece of this together with one complete worked example, because seeing the whole framework applied to a single real situation makes it click in a way that hearing the pieces separately sometimes doesn't. Imagine someone who's been quietly unhappy with their finances for years, vaguely aware that something isn't working, but never having taken a clear, honest look at why. Using the tracking tool, they spend 2 weeks writing down every single purchase, no matter how small, and discover something they hadn't consciously noticed before. Small, frequent purchases, coffee, delivery fees, unused subscriptions, are quietly draining more money each month than they ever would have guessed, far more than any single big purchase they could point to and blame. Using the responsibility principle instead of blaming their income, their bank, or the economy, they accept that these specific small purchases were choices, repeated automatically, that they're fully capable of changing. Using the margin strategy, instead of trying to overhaul their entire financial life overnight, they pick exactly one small, specific change, canceling 2 unused subscriptions and automatically transferring that exact amount into savings the same day their paycheck lands, before they have a chance to spend it elsewhere. Using environment and influence design, they unsubscribed from a few retail email lists that were quietly triggering impulse purchases, and they have one honest conversation with a friend who's also trying to save more, agreeing to check in with each other every Friday about how the week went. Using momentum, they understand that the first month of this new pattern will feel like the hardest, mostly because it's unfamiliar, not because the plan itself is flawed, and they commit to pushing through that initial friction rather than reading it as a sign to quit. 3 months in, the dollar amount saved still looks fairly modest, and on its own, it might not seem like much to brag about. But the habit itself has become close to automatic. The tracking has revealed 2 more small leaks worth addressing next, and the entire trajectory of their financial life has measurably bent in a new direction. None of this involved a single dramatic decision. It involved one honest tracking period, one specific small margin, one piece of accountability, and enough consistency to let compounding start doing the rest of the work on its own. Let's run through one more worked example, this time outside of money, to show how the exact same framework applies just as cleanly to building a skill or advancing a career. Imagine someone who's wanted to switch careers for years, but has never made real progress, mostly because every time they think about it, the gap between where they are and where they want to be feels too large to even know where to start. Using the tracking tool, instead of tracking spending, they track their actual time for 1 week and discover that they're spending several hours a day on low-value scrolling and background television they don't even remember choosing to watch, time that, added up, is more than enough to build a genuinely new skill if redirected. Using the responsibility principle, instead of blaming their busy schedule or lack of free time, they accept that the time was technically always there. It was simply being spent on autopilot rather than deliberately. Using the margin strategy, they don't attempt some dramatic, unsustainable plan like studying for 3 hours every night. They commit to one small, specific, repeatable margin, 25 focused minutes on the new skill every weekday morning before checking their phone at all. Using momentum, they accept that the first 2 weeks will likely feel slow and a bit frustrating, since they're building a brand new habit essentially from a dead stop, and they commit to continuing anyway rather than reading that early friction as proof the plan isn't working. Using influences, they join one small online community of other people learning the exact same skill, partly for occasional tips, but mainly so that consistent practice starts to feel like the normal, expected behavior of the group they're now part of, rather than a lonely, private grind nobody else around them is doing. 6 months in, 25 minutes a day adds up to roughly 60 full hours of focused, deliberate practice, far more than most people who only intend to find time eventually will ever actually accumulate. The visible skill level after 6 months still has plenty of room to grow, and on any single day, the 25 minutes never once felt like a remarkable, life-changing event. But the consistent direction is now unmistakable, built entirely from one small, sustainable daily margin, applied with enough patience to let compounding take over. Before we move toward the close, let's cover a few tactical mistakes people commonly make specifically while trying to put this framework into practice, separate from the bigger picture obstacles we already discussed. The first tactical mistake is choosing a margin that isn't clearly measurable. Eat healthier, or be more productive sound like reasonable goals, but they're too vague to track honestly, which means you'll have no reliable way of knowing whether you actually did the thing on any given day. Eat one vegetable at dinner, or write for 25 minutes before checking my phone, are measurable, specific, and leave no ambiguity about whether you followed through. The second tactical mistake is tracking too many things simultaneously during the awareness phase. Trying to honestly track your spending, your food, your screen time, and your sleep all at once usually produces sloppy, incomplete data on all four fronts, simply because keeping up with that much tracking is its own significant effort. One area, tracked thoroughly and honestly for 2 full weeks, produces far more useful insight than 4 areas tracked half-heartedly for 3 days before the whole effort quietly falls apart. The third tactical mistake is treating the first few weeks as a referendum on whether the entire approach works. As we covered earlier, the first few weeks of any compounding strategy are specifically the period where results are least visible, almost by definition. Evaluating the framework's effectiveness based on week 2 is a bit like evaluating a tree's growth by checking on it the day after you planted the seed. The fourth tactical mistake is choosing a margin that depends entirely on willpower rather than being supported by environment or accountability. A goal like, "I'll just try harder to resist late-night snacking," relies purely on in-the-moment self-control, which, as we discussed, is an unreliable resource, especially late at night when willpower is naturally at its weakest. A goal supported by environment design, simply not having the tempting snack in the house, paired with accountability, telling a partner or roommate about the specific change, will reliably outperform willpower alone, almost every single time. Before we move toward the close of this video, let's talk about something a little uncomfortable, but genuinely important: the hidden cost of all those small choices that never get tracked, examined, or questioned in the first place. The danger of small negative choices isn't that any single one of them does real damage. It's that they're so easy to dismiss precisely because they're small, which means they almost never get caught, questioned, or corrected before they've had years to compound. A single overspent week doesn't bankrupt anyone. A single skipped workout doesn't ruin anyone's health. A single distracted conversation doesn't end a relationship. The actual damage comes from the same small choice, repeated without examination, hundreds or thousands of times, until the accumulated gap between where you are and where you assumed you'd be becomes large enough to finally demand your attention, usually at a much less convenient moment than if you'd caught it years earlier. This cost is especially dangerous because it almost never announces itself clearly along the way. There's no specific notification telling you, "This particular unexamined purchase is the one quietly reshaping your financial future," or, This particular skipped conversation is the one quietly building distance in your relationship. The cost only becomes visible much later, as a vague, accumulated sense that something isn't quite where you expected it to be, without ever being able to point to one specific moment that caused it. The encouraging side of this exact same mechanism is that it runs with the same relentless consistency in the opposite direction, and it doesn't require some dramatic turning point to start working in your favor. The version of you who tracks honestly for 2 weeks, picks one specific small margin, and sticks with it isn't doing anything that looks remarkable on any individual day. But that same compounding mechanism that quietly built the gap you're unhappy with is just as willing and just as mathematically reliable to quietly close it, one small, consistent choice at a time. There's a pattern worth noticing across nearly everyone who's built something genuinely remarkable, whether in their finances, their health, their relationships, or their career. It's almost never the result of one extraordinary decision or one lucky break that explains the whole story, even though that's usually the version that gets told afterward, because dramatic stories are simply more interesting to tell than years of quiet, repeated consistency. Underneath almost every one of those stories sits the same unglamorous foundation: small, specific margins, applied consistently, for far longer than most people would have had the patience to sustain. This carries an important, almost liberating implication. You don't need some rare talent, some lucky break, or some dramatic turning point in order to build a meaningfully different life. You need exactly three things this framework has handed you directly: an honest, specific choice, repeated consistently, given enough time to compound. None of those three ingredients require permission, luck, or perfect circumstances. They're available to you starting with whatever you choose to do in the next few minutes. So let's take one small action together right now. Pick exactly one area of your life you suspect is quietly working against you. Commit to tracking it honestly, with no judgment, for just the next 7 days. Tell one specific person what you're doing and ask them to check in with you at the end of the week. That's the entire starting move. Nothing dramatic, nothing that requires waiting for the right moment. Just one honest week of paying attention to something you've probably been ignoring for far longer than you'd like to admit. Before you go, let's do one short visualization together. Close your eyes for a moment if you can and picture yourself exactly 3 years from today. Picture a version of you who picked one honest, specific margin after watching this video and stuck with it, imperfectly but consistently, for 3 full years. Picture the quiet, almost understated confidence in how that version of you talks about money, or health, or relationships, not because any single dramatic event transformed their life, but because they let one small, smart choice compound for 3 years longer than most people are ever willing to wait. That version of you isn't some distant, unreachable fantasy. It's simply the natural, almost mathematical result of choosing one specific margin today and refusing to abandon it during the long, quiet stretch before the results become impossible to ignore. The only real distance between you and that version of yourself is the next small, honest choice you make, starting right now. Thanks for staying with this video all the way to the end. Your compound effect starts with whatever you choose to track and change in the next 24 hours.